Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening on this lovely weather, and thank you for venturing out to be with us. I'm Daphna Shohami. I'm a principal investigator at the Zuckerman Mind-Brain Behavior Institute, and it's my pleasure to invite you to join us today for our second lecture of this academic year in the Niarchos Foundation Public Brain Insight Lecture Series. So tonight's lecture will continue our very strong roster of fascinating speakers with a presentation by Dr. Mike Shadlen on how the brain decides, thinks, and creates. And this whole series of lectures, and hopefully some of you have had the opportunity to be with us before, is really made possible completely through the generous philanthropy of the Niarchos Foundation. They've been funding not just this lecture series, but also a complementary teacher-student training program that really works to help high school and middle school teachers learn about the brain so that they can incorporate neuroscience into their curriculum and bring it back down to the students. So thank you very much for the support of all these important initiatives. It's a really particularly exciting time now at Columbia to be engaged in thinking about the mind and brain. For those of you who are not familiar with it, we're here as representatives of a much broader initiative at Columbia as part of the Zuckerman Mind-Brain Behavior Institute, which as its epicenter has one of the new buildings, the Green Center for Science, located on the Manhattanville campus. Actually, as we speak, more and more labs are moving in, and that building is becoming populated. And it's a lot of energy, a lot of new scholars and researchers addressing questions about the mind and brain. What we're going to hear about tonight from Mike Shadlen is his work on how the brain decides, thinks, and creates. It's kind of fun and challenging to introduce Dr. Michael Shadlen to you for a number of reasons. One of them is that one of the reasons it's challenging is that Dr. Shadlen actually has so many areas of expertise that it's hard to know how to introduce him. He is a neurologist who thinks about patients and treatment and was trained at Brown University and then at Stanford University. And so he has a very particular perspective in thinking about the human condition and its vulnerabilities, and is a member of the National Academy of Medicine. But he's not just a neurologist. He is completely separately also one of the most famous successful neuroscientists anywhere. And in fact, we worked really hard to recruit him here just a few years ago from University of Washington. So he's also a successful neuroscientist. He also is a philosopher, if you let him be. So he likes to think very broadly about questions about the mind and what they mean for free will and the human condition. Hopefully he'll indulge us with some of those thoughts today. And finally, he's a jazz guitarist. And that is not just sort of a cute thing on his CV, but it's actually something that I think really affects the way he thinks about how the brain works and how consciousness is related to creativity, is related to decision making. So when he speaks about these topics, he really thinks about them from multiple perspectives and brings that all to bear in on his science. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Shadlen, who will share his thoughts about the brain with us tonight.
Well, thank you so much, Daphna, and thank you all for weathering the storm. I left sunny Seattle 5 years ago for rainy New York. Who knew? I'm going to talk to you tonight about, as Daphna said, how the brain decides, thinks, and creates. And let's just have a little fun with it, given the coldness outside. So let me start with a definition for you. A decision, like the one between these two roads, is a commitment to a proposition among alternatives that arises through a process of deliberation. And I believe that the neural mechanisms, the brain mechanisms of decision-making, provide a window on cognition and ultimately on the failures of cognition in disorders, neurology and psychiatry. Now, I use the word cognitive because that refers to operations that are more elaborate than sensory motor programs. and which unfold on a flexible time frame. They involve things like evaluation, what the psychologists call prospection, meaning imagining yourself, for example, at the end of those paths and wondering whether you regret where you were or whether you're happy. So imagining yourself in the future. Strategizing, pretty obvious, and planning. They involve things that even simple animals do in the name of decision making, which is to forage for food and for mates, and to explore. And I think that in thinking about exploration in a non-capricious, meaning non-random sense, that is in a directed sense, that's effectively at the heart or the mind of creativity and improvisation. Now tonight, we're going to start. I have a whole bunch of things to tell you about, and we'll just have some fun with. Some of them are quite soft, and some of them are, might require you to put on your thinking caps. But we'll talk about interrogation, that very briefly, have a little fun. And then I'll talk, the bulk of the talk will be about decision making and reasoning. You'll get to hear some neurons in the brain. I'll talk to you about time and aesthetics. And finally, time permitting, we'll talk a little bit about consciousness. Okay, now, as Daphne said, I'm a neurologist, and I found doing neurology extremely rewarding, not really because patients fascinated me, but because of a feeling that my interest in the brain helped me both make diagnoses, of course, and manage patients, but also helped me to connect to people's difficulties. What are the kinds of things that you struggle with when you have a problem? Or how to make decisions at end of life. That's a good reason for any of you budding doctors to make sure you take your philosophy and ethics courses, because there's so much of that at the bedside. Now, I study a part of the brain that's responsible for knowing. Okay? And so the Greeks would call it gnosis. And when you fail at knowing, we call that agnosia, sometimes neglect, or anosagnosia, meaning you don't even know you're sick. So the thing is that if someone has a problem, say, with their vision, because they have a hole in the back or a stroke or a tumor that affects their visual cortex or their eye or the pathways to the brain, they come to the doctor and they say, my goodness, I cannot see. But the patient with neglect is unaware of half of the world and doesn't know it. And that means that they're very difficult to rehabilitate because they don't know what to look for. They don't ask questions of the world in the first place. So I want to encourage you to think, this is, by the way, a model that a patient was asked to copy, and this is the copy of the clock. Notice very few things to the left of the midline, although there are a few exceptions. So loss of the parietal lobe does not mean you can't see. It doesn't mean you can't feel, but it might mean you deny that there's a right half of the world, or it might mean you deny there's a right half of your own body, or it might mean you deny that you're even sick. Okay? So it's about knowledge. And the thing is that from a neurologist's point of view, I think of knowledge not as processing of information in some logical sense, the way essentially we're taught to think about information in a computer science, mathematical way, but rather knowledge is related to interrogation with a purpose. That's how it's organized in the brain. How many of you have seen the demonstration of people passing balls? And if you know the answer to this, just raise your hand if you've seen this before. Yikes. Okay, well that's about half of you. Okay, so don't spoil it for the rest. Here's the deal. I want you to count how many times the players in white pass the basketball to each other. You ready? Here we go. All right. Who wants to yell out a number? 14. I think that's right. It might have been 15, but you know, okay. Now, raise your hand if you saw a peculiar thing happen in the middle of that movie. Raise your hand if you did not see a gorilla walking out in the middle of that movie. All right. Now, I really don't want to go through the whole thing so slowly, but check this out. Now that you know what to see, I'll stop it right when we get to the point. So you're busy counting all those passes, and you're blind to that gorilla walking there. Check this out. Look what he does. All right. Okay. All right. So that's an example of change blindness. I call it change distraction. Okay. I'll tell you why in a second. Here's a picture of a bunch of people are about to board an airplane, do something probably pretty dangerous. And tell me, this thing should be blinking at you. Tell me what changes in this picture. Look around and see if you can figure out there's something that's changing. It's a very important thing. You'd like to make sure you would notice this if it was not present. Has everyone seen that the engine? Okay, right? All right, there's the engine coming and going. Okay. All right. So now we call this change blindness, but a better term for it is change distraction. Because seeing, if you see that engine came and went on your visual cortex. It came and went in your eye. Okay? Your brain is doing a fine job representing the engine. Okay? Similarly with the gorilla in the last film. So, but what you don't see is because you're interrogating other things in the scene. Why do we interrogate things in the scene? One reason why is because there's a sudden change, a sudden bright light. Another reason why is because I asked you to count the ball players. Right? So if you're not interrogating, you don't see it in the sense of perceiving it, in the sense of being aware of it, in the sense of being able to use the information. Now that's a very important insight, and it's one that's driven my research. To be honest, before it was research, it drove my thinking about the brain when I was an undergraduate. And that is, most of us, and I'll exclude myself from this error, most people think that the way we see is something like what's depicted here, that there's a representation of this egg in the brain somehow. But the problem is, I've just told you that representation is not sufficient for perception. So the idea goes that there's something deep in the brain that somehow interprets this egg and brings it to awareness. Well, that's something in the brain, people use the term homunculus, like another human sitting in the brain. Doesn't make sense. It's sort of what I call resorting to magic, because you know, you can have that. Who's going to make that brain sense this egg? Well, it leads to this infinite regress. It just doesn't work. On the other hand, if you start thinking about perception as the answers to questions, might I look here? Might I reach here? Might I walk here? Might I eat this? Then the information comes in already essentially guided with a purpose. It's bearing on a decision. Should I do something? Should I maybe even say the word? Okay, so let's talk about decision making. I want to point out that, as I said, decision making as a study, is an area of inquiry, provides a window, I think, on all of normal cognition and hopefully its disorders. And that's because it requires two things to reach something that is not programmatic, is not reflex-like. And that is flexibility with both time and choice or contingency. So here is a simple working memory test. It's the simplest memory task you can think of. And I'm embarrassed to show it in front of Daphne, who's an expert in memory, but I'm going to do it anyway. So you stare at this white dot. And you wait. A red spot's going to appear somewhere. Your job is to remember its location while you stare at that white spot. And then make an eye movement. Look to the remembered location of the red spot. Now, if this was an experiment, you'd have to, I'd put the red spot in all kinds of places to trick you and make sure you were being honest, all right? So that's pretty trivial, but if you think about what it takes in the brain to achieve such a thing, it takes some kind of activity in the brain that lasts on the order of seconds. That's not the way neurons work, neurons being nerve cells. So I'm going to play you now a recording from the brain of an animal where we can listen to the neuron. Now, neurons don't make noise, as I'm sure you know. They make a little electrical discharges, and that's their way of ultimately communicating with other neurons. The electrical discharge ultimately comes to the end of the neuron, releases neurotransmitter, and that's the form of information communication in the brain. But what we can do with that electrical discharge is play it through the loudspeaker, and if we're lucky, we'll get to hear a neuron in the brain during that working memory task. Come on. I'm afraid to hit this again, because if I do, yay. Okay. That little yellow thing you saw, that was the eye movement of the animal who was doing this. Now you see that this elevated activity that you heard obviously very loudly, and you can see by those little tick marks, that represents this persistent activity, this elevation of activity that represents, it so happens, specifically the region of space that that red spot was in. And you could think of it as representing a plan to ultimately make an eye movement there, or equivalently, the memory of the location. And this persistent activity is seen throughout the newer parts of our brain, the so-called association cortex. And the reason that's important is because in evolution, that's the part of the brain that got bigger and supported cognition. And it conferred a freedom from immediacy. It meant that we could use information in a time frame not governed by immediate changes in the world, like sensation, and not required to keep real-time fidelity with the control of a body. To me, that's what had to happen for us to evolve our possibilities of thought in a flexible time frame and with contingency. So now I'm going to show you an experiment where we exploit the properties of those neurons to study decision making. And this is a pretty complicated experiment. I would say that it's probably one of the more difficult experiments we've ever tried to do with an animal. Okay, so what you're going to see now is a series of shapes that are going to be presented, and this, in this case, this is a monkey. We'll try to figure out whether he should choose the green target or the red target. And the thing is, there are 5 shapes that support red. This one being the most reliable, this the least. 5 that favor green, the diamond being the most reliable. I should use this thing. And so the task is to try to put together the evidence from the shapes that are shown and make the best choice possible to gain some reward. So here's how the trials would unfold. We'll do it together to try and sort of make sure this is in your head. So you probably didn't memorize that the pentagon was weak evidence for red. But it was. That's the first thing that's shown. Then a triangle, it so happens, then a Pac-Man, and then this second Pac-Man. So on the net, what would you choose, green or red? Green, that would be the better choice. Now, this task is strange. We call it weather prediction, because although the probabilities favor that the green should be the one that you should choose, it's not guaranteed that you would get a reward there. It's kind of like the weather. It only predicts, it provides some probabilistic basis for making that choice. And somehow or another, the animals are able to learn that just as humans do. Okay, so now let's listen to a neuron that's doing the probabilistic calculation. Okay, lots and lots of activity that you heard. Okay, and those are those spikes, those little electrical events that you heard over the speaker. And the more of them means the more excited the neuron is. And what this graph is showing you here are the 4 shapes in the order that they were shown. And this is where the net evidence is. Sorry, I need to use this arrow because this is being simulcasted. This is where the evidence is after the first shape. It actually supported green, but weakly. This yellow line going across the middle is the neutral evidence line. And the next shape, a weak support for red. Now the net support is for red, then more support for red, then more support for red. So there's this rising support that red is the better choice. That's the one that the monkey chose. And you saw and heard the rise in the activity, okay, the increase in the firing rate of the neuron, right? The spikes got closer packed together. Okay, let's listen to, I have a few more movies. I'll just show you a bunch of these. Okay, so the choice was for green, and you can see that the first shape favored red, and then the triangle kind of reversed that, pretty much made things neutral. It's 50-50 now, whether red or green is the better choice. And then 2 Pac-Man symbols that led to net support in favor of green, and that was the choice. Now look what's going on with the neuron. First, there's a nice robust response. All these spikes are close together in time. That's a high firing rate. And then there's mounting evidence against this red target and in favor of green. Now, I didn't tell you this, but the neuron we're recording it's one of those neurons that has working memory. That is, it's planning a trip to the red symbol, to the red target. And so what you're hearing now is a decrescendo, to use the musical expression, in the firing rate. That noise went less down as the evidence increased against this choice and for the green. Okay? Let's hear another one. All right, so that's probably the most interesting one, because now we have weak support for green. That's the target that should elicit a big response. Mounting evidence against green, the response goes down. And one more shape that flipped things around back to green. So you're seeing these responses change shape by shape as more and more evidence comes in guiding a choice, guiding a decision. And so it's rare that you can do this. Listen to a single neuron in the brain and hear it doing arithmetic. It's adding, and it's actually doing a running sum. And for the high school students, that's like an integral, right? And so it's accumulating evidence in favor of, in this case, whatever target happens to be in this part of the visual field, because that's the part of space that this neuron will respond with persistent activity in favor of. Now, we do other experiments where we allow the animal to decide not between red and green, but between two places in space, and to look at a bunch of shapes that come and go, and ultimately make a decision whenever you're ready. So maybe it took you 9 shapes to make a decision in favor of right on that one. Let's just listen to that last. This will be the last movie I show you with the spikes, but I can't resist. Now, the interesting thing about this now is that, again, we're seeing things I probably don't have to explain to you anymore. Because initially there was something that favored this choice target, and then we went against it. Response goes a little low. Then it started to rise again a crescendo in the firing rate. Okay, so you can see the neuron doing adding and subtracting and really cumulative running sums. And the interesting thing to us is that this response gets very high, and if I showed you a bunch of trials, it would turn out it reaches about the same firing rate, the same level of activity when the animal pulls the trigger and says, I have enough information. Now, so I'm going to say 2 things about this. First of all, since I've talked about animals doing things, I think I should take a moment and make sure you understand that when we do experiments on animals, number 1, we make sure they experience no pain. Number 2, you should know that the brain, like our brains, has no pain receptors inside the head. So if you have a neurosurgery, and I hope you never do, but if you do, what we do is you're asleep during any of the potentially painful parts, but once the skull is removed, you're not bothered at all if we put an electrode in your brain, like for example, as is done in Parkinson's disease and so forth. And so what you can do is you can record the neuron, and it doesn't bother the monkey at all. So he's awake doing all those things. He has no idea that we're spying on the machinery of his thought, that is, these neurons. So I think that I just didn't want you leaving here thinking that that we've done something nasty to these animals. We respect them tremendously for their intelligence to be able to do these tasks. And you can see these are pretty complicated tasks. All right, so let me just tell you what we think we've learned from many, many years of recordings in the brain of animals and testing in humans and animals on the similar tasks. We've learned that a decision is made by accumulating evidence. The evidence is in units of belief. And so this is for the high school students who are probably learning these things, because when a degree of belief, that's a strange thing to think you could put a measurement on. But if you have a probability for the red target and you have a probability for the green target, and you take their ratio and you take the logarithm of it, that's a unit of belief. Let's just work this one out together. Is that, let's say that you saw something neutral. That means the probability of the red is the better target is 0.5. Well, that means that the probability the green's the better target is also 0.5. 0.5 over 0.5 is 1. I'm looking to you guys because I'm thinking you're high school students. All right. 0.5 divided by 0.5 is 1, and the log of 1 is 0. So that's a natural scale for thinking about degrees of belief. And it just so happens that many very talented people have realized that over the years. I've shown you that neurons in parietal cortex. I'll show you a picture of one of them. It'll surprise you. Neurons in parietal cortex represent this accumulated evidence, which is quite a feat. And decisions terminate when the accumulated evidence reaches a critical level, a criterion level. And we think that governs the trade-off between speed and accuracy. And I won't get into it with you right now, but Daphne alluded to an interest in ethics. The trade-off between speed and accuracy, I would argue, is one of these policies that the brain uses to make decisions. So if you and I were making decisions about the same thing, we might come to different decisions. Maybe you'll be faster, but therefore a little less accurate. And maybe I'd be slow, but maybe a little more accurate. Now, sometimes your speed was a good thing, and sometimes my accuracy was a good thing. But we judge each other, to some degree, based on the differences that we have in the way we make decisions. And so I think that's a place where neuroscience connects with what philosophers of ethics care about. Okay? All right. Now, we are known to be not rational, but I just showed you a single neuron in the brain that's able to do a pretty impressive feat. I somehow eliminated my slide that shows my friend Alan Turing. Does anyone know who Alan Turing is? So Alan Turing, he was famous for a lot of things, like the Turing machine. He invented computers, or at least computer science before there were computers. But the thing that he also did, which was classified until after he'd killed himself tragically, was he helped break the German Enigma code. And the way he did that in World War II was by intercepting messages and then comparing them and looking for evidence that two random messages had their Enigma were produced by machines that were in the same state. I won't explain what that means. But he accumulated evidence in units of logarithms, of ratios of probabilities, and that was the fastest way, it turns out, to solve those kinds of judgments. And that's what, if you go to that horrible movie that depicts Alan Turing both as a traitor and as someone who must be, pathetic because he's gay and mathematically gifted, and therefore couldn't possibly be an interesting person. But if you ignore all that and watch, there's a bunch of people sitting at flat tables, and they're doing this thing of working out, accumulating in units of these log probability ratios. Okay, so we are rational, and we do math, but our brains are rational when we're just doing the simplest kinds of decisions. So how come we're supposed to be so irrational? So I'm going to give you a problem here. It's a very famous problem, and it's called the Linda problem, developed by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. So here it is. Linda is a 31-year-old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. I would have definitely been interested in Linda, I can tell you that. So, all right, so here's the question for you, though. Which of the following two alternatives is more probable? 1, Linda is a bank teller. 2, Linda is a bank teller and active in the feminist movement. Who raise your hand if you're for number 1. Raise your hand if you're for number 2. That's pretty close. Actually, it's interesting because in the experiment, 85% of people went for number 1. And this included people like, doctors and stuff, So think about it. If there's a probability that she's a bank teller, then if there's anything but probability 1 that she was active in the feminist movement, then it's less probable she could be both of those things, right? But we don't think that way. Why don't we think that way? We don't think that way because, I would argue, because when our brains may be very, okay, I'm sorry, I see I slide out of order. We don't think that way. The claim is that we don't think that way. Oh my God, sorry about that. We don't think that way because we have a fast brain that's making mistakes. And if we slow down and do the math, then we won't make mistakes. That's a topic of this fantastic book I highly recommend by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, and kind of summarized, that is both the partnership of Tversky and Kahneman in this really fun book called The Undoing Project. I recommend both of them. But the claim that it's actually that our fast brains are what gets us into trouble, I think, is exactly backwards. I think our fast brains is what I showed you a moment ago. We're extremely rational under the hood. Where we get irrational is when we create narrative. We tell stories about things. That's what you did with Linda. Once you knew all these things about Linda, okay, you know, now you found out she's a bank teller. Big deal. That's just, you know, chapter 1 of the story. Now we get to the real thing. Was she a feminist or not? Well, she probably was. She's intelligent and so forth and active, you know. So that's how I think we reason in that case mistakenly. But that's because we have narrative. We tell stories. Now, why would we do that? It sounds terrible to not be rational. Well, wait a second. By telling stories, we can navigate through very complicated information space, like medical decision making. You know, I saw a kid with a fever. Okay. Strep throat, what do you name it? You know, I saw a kid with a headache. Okay. Kids don't have that much headaches. Well, let's talk about that. You know, there could be all kinds of things going on, what's going on at home, so forth. I saw a kid with a headache and a fever. Okay, at least you've got to think about meningitis. You know, why? Because there's I mean, I'm being a little simplistic if there are medical people here, but you get the idea that in complicated scenarios where there's lots of information that bear on problems, we tell stories to get through it. So that's a way that I think we really should be thinking about why we're less than perfectly rational. And we can discuss all these things. I'd love to hear different points of view in the Q&A. I'll try to leave a lot of time for that. Okay, so now I'm going to move to the next part of the talk, which is about time and aesthetics. Now, I already told you that the key to understanding higher brain function and cognition is this freedom from immediacy. Okay, that is the ability to use information on the time frame that you need to use it, not the time frame that it was delivered or the need to control body musculature in real time. But that freedom comes with a cost, and that is that we must therefore sense and control time. So we started getting interested in this, and we thought perhaps the same parts of the brain that are able to exhibit persistent activity, this long time scale. I mean, I'm talking about hours there, which is seconds in the examples I'm giving you, but nonetheless, long time scales given the basic physics of the neurons, that they might be able to anticipate time. So I'm going to just show you a kind of a summary example of that. You get to hear another neuron. Okay, so here's the world's simplest task for a monkey again, and that is look at a spot and then wait for the red spot to dim ever so slightly. There it goes. Okay, and then when it dims, right away, as soon as you can, make an eye move into that green spot. That's it. Nothing to really remember. It's just a matter of I tell you what to do, make an eye move to the green spot, and just wait for the dimming to do it. Everyone get it? Okay, so here's the trick, is that this waiting time for the dimming, that waiting time is a random number, okay? And it's a funny random number in this experiment. It's a random number that's drawn from what we call a bimodal distribution. That is, what it says is this is time going along this axis that's drawn in this funny direction here, and this is probability. So what this means is, just to help you read this, is that it never occurs. This go signal, this dimming, never occurs at 1 second, okay? Now, it often occurs at a half a second. That's why it's a big peak there. It often occurs at around 2 seconds, okay? So that's what I mean. So there are times, early times that can happen, a time where it never happens, and then late times it can happen. Now, I'm going to show you a movie. Again, we're recording from a neuron, just one neuron, and the green spot is going to be one that is in that place that this particular neuron cares about. Okay? So, and you're going to listen to that neuron, and I'm going to prime you for what you should listen to. It's going to do something I would call anticipation. Okay? The technical term is a hazard rate. But it looks like this. Let's think of what anticipation is. You're waiting. Remember, because the trial could end at a half second, right? So it could happen any time now. Oops. But if it passes, then it's not happening. But then you're waiting some more, and if you get this far, it's very likely to happen. So anticipation is this dash curve. It could happen. Oops. It could happen. It's got to happen. Okay? Now, I want you to think about that as a triphasic sound, because I'm setting you up so you can hear this. You're going to hear a neuron, and I want you to listen closely and see if you can detect that it rises in activity, then falls in activity, and then rises again in activity. Okay? See if you get it. Oh, you'll see an eye position again, but it'll be a little yellow dot, so don't worry about it. I orchestrated it for you. But did everyone raise your hand if you did not hear it go up, down, and up? Okay, good. I'm going to play it again because sometimes people miss it. They just don't want to admit it. Okay, you really can't miss it. Now, I'm not showing you all the control trials. If we do a unimodal distribution, then we just see a rise and so forth. It turns out that these neurons that care about, in this case, care about making an eye movement, okay, they're sending their information to parts of the brain that are ultimately going to make the movement. They're receiving information from vision, but they're associating it in a very flexible way, okay? In this case, they're anticipating time. Now, that's kind of interesting. It runs counter to what we'd think about for timing as a clock. It's timing as anticipation, okay? And now I want to make the point and connect this to the aesthetics, to art. So time, I think, is the key to thought, and it's the key to what we would regard as most of the arts and aesthetics, and to be honest, a lot of other things we enjoy in life, including doing mathematics, that is, or telling stories. So the idea is simple. Time is understood by having a sense of when something's going to occur, right? So that's the first thing to say. Okay, so there's some sense of a pulse in time, but there's a sense of an expectation then. And when we play with that expectation, whether we're playing funk or swing, and we're just kind of off where the metronome is, then we kind of build up a little sense of something and then deliver. Right? So, and of course, if we have a nice pulse that we come back to all the time, then we don't mind synchronizing and coming back on the beat, you know? So that was, I didn't really stutter there. I just was trying to play games with you, get you to anticipate when I was going to complete the word. And because you're doing that all the time with as you parse language, as you make sense of these sentences, you are waiting and being surprised when things don't come when your brain expected them. Now, I think obviously this occurs for these great artists, all of who did their music in New York. You've heard of the John Coltrane and Charlie Parker. You probably haven't heard of Sylvia Cuenca unless you're a serious jazz fan, an amazing drummer in town when she's not traveling. And then, of course, here's one of my favorite artists, Kerry James Marshall, depiction of people dancing in the hair salon, one of his famous paintings, School of Beauty. And I'm going to take the liberty of showing a piece of my own artwork in order to show you that in simple perception, there is a sense of anticipation and completion. And by the way, I should say, there's one little step that takes us from the world of just all of perception and thought, which has to do with interrogating and finding answers by anticipating, to art. And I think that step involves a little bit of a social, almost contract. It involves an implied communication between the artist and the beholder about whom the artist, I'll be the artist for a moment, has theory of mind. So it's situated. This is the first of two times I'm going to come back to this concept, but in the service of art, the idea is the artist imbues in you some sense of where things are going to go. And then before delivering on the resolution, maybe teases a bit, maybe takes you out of the key or out of time, and then brings things back to the one, or whatever it's going to be. So that, I think, is the generic prescription for art, for the aesthetic, and also it's at the core, what I said earlier, of perceiving anything. So I think in art we celebrate our cognition. We just do it in this social way that is more abstract. Now, here's something that I made called Between Symmetry and Charybdis. Now, it's take a look at this and stare at it for a while. Now, if any of you have had LSD before you came, this is probably mimicking your experience. Not that I would know. But depending on where you look, you'll see circles moving up and down in all kinds of ways and things swirling. And Charybdis was the water. What's it called? Whirlpool. Thank you. Either that or the monster that made the whirlpool. But whatever. And so this is a play on a famous expression of between a rock and a stone. Anyway, you're all seeing this, right? And have you been tracking some of these things going across the screen for a while? Anyone track things going all the way across? You have a sense, though, things are moving around in circles and moving, yeah? It turns out that there's only 4 frames in that movie, okay? First frame, second frame, third, whoops, and fourth. Okay, that's it. And you've been sitting there looking at the same 4 pictures over and over again in a loop. Okay, and the reason that this works is because it's an illusion that fools your brain into seeing motion at each point in space, and then you anticipate there must be something, some contour in some direction related to the motion you saw, and indeed it keeps getting supplied, and you just fill in the connection and things look like they continue to move. It might be hard for you to get that from this, so I'll show you 2 more pieces of art. This dates me tremendously because this was my son, I should say my daughter. No, that's not a joke at all. That's my son is now my daughter. But when my daughter was my son, this picture was taken. That was 31 years ago, and I had him when I was 8, by the way. This is the growing baby illusion, and this is the changing baby illusion. And again, these are just 4 frames. Okay. Of course, the baby doesn't keep growing. Some people call it exploding baby. I find that offensive. The rotation doesn't really happen. You can see that every half second or second, the baby's right back where he was. Okay, and so here are your 4 frames. It's really obvious. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's it. So okay, so that's just a little piece of fun visual art, visual illusion that says that in vision, in perception, that also involves some kind of directed investigation, and it involves some kind of prediction. We'd call it anticipation, word in time, and a resolution. And your brain is satisfied with that and sees that as evidence for the percept, and that's what we understand. And I would just say that this argument about aesthetics, I think, has been made by other people. I'm showing you one book by a guy named David Huron called Sweet Anticipation, which I think is very good. There's a lot of other books, I'm told, that are even better, but I haven't read them, and I always feel it's inexcusable to recommend a book I haven't read. Okay, so I'll just summarize this part of the talk. Time and aesthetics, we experience time as anticipation. That is that we feel time in a kind of intentional by now sense as opposed to a representational clock-like sense. And that neurons represent those anticipation or preparation kinds of signals. And then I've made these points about the aesthetics, so I just lay them up there. You can read them. But I do want to say that, that in a sense, when we create as the artist, not as the beholder who's anticipating and feeling the resolution, then we're just playing, really. But we're playing in a directed way, and I think a socially directed way, to try and imbue in someone else, even if it's not someone that you can see. If you're in the recording studio, it is an implied social communication that that person is going to understand that I want that this cadence should go back to the tonic, the key of C. It should go back to the C chord. But maybe as a jazz improviser, maybe you're going to fool around a little bit first, okay? And then deliver, or not. Okay. All right, so now we're at the last bit. How are we doing? Time, we're all right? Okay, I'll finish this.
5 minutes.
Great, perfect. I will solve consciousness for you in 5 minutes. Seriously, it's not as hard a problem as people say. Okay, all right. So we started with this idea that knowledge, gnosis in the Greek, to use the Greek, is structured as an interrogation with a purpose. Really, you could sort of think of that as making a decision. And when we record from places in the brain, like I showed you those neurons. I didn't tell you where they were, but they're in this area of the parietal lobe. I did say that. But a particular area that projects to areas of the brain that care about eye movements. Fine. And yet they're knowing something about, in this case, probabilities about shapes and colors and things like that. Okay, but if I recorded across this sulcus into this area, this is also part of the parietal lobe. It gets the same kind of inputs as this area, but it projects the structures in the brain that care about how we move our arm. Okay, if we answered with an arm movement, then it turns out those neurons are relevant. In fact, if we answer with either, but we know that we could answer with either, both of them. So we have a kind of a parallel processing in this kind of what I would call an intentional framework. If we go down the sulcus, this is less studied, this area, but it gets slightly different visual inputs, but still they're visual. And it projects to parts of the brain that care about how we hold our hand if we're going to reach for objects. I would say that that's our knowledge of shape. So I refer to these as provisional affordances. And they occur in structures in the brain that don't have to keep up with the changing world once again. They have persistence. They have what my favorite philosopher, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, called temporal thickness. And they're directed, they're intentional, okay? So they're not that representation that needs that homunculus, looking at the homunculus, looking at the homunculus, right, in the brain. They're directed at propositions. So I would say that all of knowledge, in my view, is organized as as this provisional affordance. Let me define the affordance word. Provisional is obvious. It just says you don't have to do this. It's not an immediate action. That's the whole point. But an affordance is a term that James J. Gibson made up. It's a quality or property of an object that defines its possible use or makes clear how it can or should be used. And in this theory that Gibson had, which I don't completely subscribe to, it's still kind of useful to read his version of it, that the world is perceived not only in terms of object shapes and spatial relationships, but also in terms of object possibilities for action. That's what he means by affordances. And so in that sense, perception drives action, but that's what I'm trying to escape from. I want perception to be sort of live on its own. I'm saying in the brain it's organized as if it were directed to a possible action, hence the word provisional. Now, one way to illustrate an affordance is through this video. I find this funny. Maybe it's a little bit cruel, but you'll see an extreme example of an affordance. So this guy was pulled over in his car for drunk driving. There's a cop that's giving him a breathalyzer. That's what you're seeing sort of poking in from the left side of the figure. All right. So now you know what an affordance is, okay? You'll never forget what an affordance is, okay? Apologies in some ways. But when we're trained to learn about all the visual pathways, and we're trained to think that a pathway from the eye that goes to the visual cortex, that's what this OC is standing for, don't worry about all these letters, makes one path to the north, and that's the where pathway. One path to the south, that's the what pathway. It's nonsense. This way, people have already decided, have come to the realization, this is just a how pathway. A how what? How I reach, how I look, how I hold my hand if I'm going to reach for something. And my claim is that the what pathway is also a how pathway. These hows are things to do with foraging, with mating. You know, it's not might I reach here, might I look here. It's might I mate with this, might I eat this, might I come back to this if I've tried something else, if I've gone down that left path, do I want to hold on to my memory of my thoughts of the right path, so forth. These are all, I would say, how might I really, okay? So that's a way to think about the organization of information in the brain. I think it's extremely important. It's what distinguishes us from all of the algorithms that are so successful, be it at playing Go and playing chess and processing information, which it's very good to have things like that because they'll be much better than us at the things we need to do, just as airplanes are better than birds at some things, and just as machinery can lift things we can't lift, we will use computers. But we will not understand how the brain works by thinking about the algorithms that work at Google, DeepMind, and so forth. Just one person's thought. You can reject it, but I'm telling you, it just so happens to be true. Okay, so, all right. So now, finally, on the consciousness point. All right. As a neurologist, consciousness is really kind of a simple concept. It's whether you wake up. Okay. And that's a useful. Believe me, that's not all I'm going to tell you. But that's a useful thing to think about. I'm going to tell you that consciousness is also just another provisional affordance, but I haven't said which kind it is. To wake up is easy. You want to engage the world. So, for example, when I lived in Seattle, I slept through this. That's the rain, you see. You don't know about rain in New York. And then when I moved here, I slept through this. Okay? But like many of you, I'm sure, hopefully not the high school students yet, I wake up to this at some one point in my life, well, 30 years ago. Okay? Now, whoops, please. Consciousness, in this case, the waking up from sleep, is a decision of the non-conscious brain to engage those sounds. It was a decision not to engage the traffic sounds in the rain. okay? So that, thinking of that as a decision is useful. I won't get into the details, but since we know something about how the arousal systems and how we wake up from sleep, we have a lot to learn. But since we know something about it, I'm going to claim that's going to give us a little hook into the neurobiology of the more interesting consciousness. And by that I mean consciousness for the people, okay? Or which means philosopher, psychologist. When we sit around saying consciousness is interesting, we're not talking about waking up from sleep. I mean, it's important as a neurologist to be able to do coma exams and so forth. But we're talking about, you know, like understanding the world. But that is another provisional affordance in my view. It's a decision effectively to possibly, there's that provisional word again, to report to another agent. And it's an agent about whom I have a theory about how their mind works. Okay? And equivalent to that is that I could be reporting to myself. So let's think about this guy who's sitting here looking at this drill. Okay? Now, I would say in the sort of animal pre-conscious way, he knows the drill as something he can reach to. Something that might roll if he turns a certain way, that might fall off the table if he was to lift an end of it. All kinds of provisional ways of thinking about things he could do to the world and that would have some kind of a change. Obviously, he could hold it in a certain way and put a hole in a piece of wood too. So that's, you know, the Gibson affordance. Okay? It has a certain kind of utility. Now, it turns out there's another person. Oh, hold on. I got to make this work. No, it didn't work. Oh, okay, we're going to have to do this another way. I have to show you this. Okay. All right, I don't know why that didn't work. But do you see now there's this other person, this young woman, who is sitting here, and she also sees the drill. Now, it turns out she's pointing out the drill. Oh, shoot. Here we go. I can make that happen. This is going to be dangerous to do, but I'm going to make it happen. Okay, now you can see it, right? Yes. All right. Well, I don't have to play the movie. You saw that, and then now we see there was actually a second person. Now, it turns out the reason the guy was looking at the drill was because this woman showed him the drill. Okay, he was oblivious, like most guys are. Okay, and so let's think about that for a second. Now this drill, let's think about it from her point of view. You could do either of them. They both have theory of mind about the other. Now this drill exists not in a place in space that any one of them could reach to, not and hold their hand in a certain way, but now it exists in a space that's also occupied by another mind. So that drill now has a presence in the world independent of the self. It's like it's there independent of me. You know, it could have been me with walking around the table too. That gets us a long way to having what corresponds to our conscious sense of things. And remember, it even comes some way to what the philosophers call qualia, because the guy knows he's seeing a part of that drill that the woman can't see. It's private to him. And he knows that she's seeing parts of that drill that he can't see. So we have our private sense, our private subjective sense of things. But they're only private and subjective in the sense that there's another being that can't take avail of that. And so and I could have said the same thing from the woman's point of view, of course. And so that's, I think, a big step toward understanding, and in some ways kind of making consciousness very tractable, you know, in a sense by giving this drill its presence independent of each other. Plato, and given it in essence. Okay, so, oh, I can't do that anymore. Speaking of affordances, wow, hold on. We're ready to conclude and end the evening and get wet. Oh, some of you got to see my joke. La gente unida jamás será vencido. So Daphne left out. I used to be quite an activist in my early days. So those are the things we would yell at rallies. We're going to have to start yelling them again soon, people. And now, but I made one up for consciousness, which is La gente unida jamás será dormido, that the people united will never be asleep. It doesn't quite work. I'm working on it. Okay. So, all right. So I've told you tonight that thought is an interrogative process. a provisional implementation of a behavior or a strategy or anything like that, just something propositional and directed, and it's structured as a decision process. And notice, these are all things that we have a little bit of a handle on in neurobiology. The questions are about possible things we might do. That includes rules and strategies, and it's established through exploration, creativity, discovery, and progress. Give us a hook on some of these really complicated things in cognition. And the answers to these questions, to these interrogations, build on expectancy or anticipation, and they, I think, are the seeds of artistic expression as well. Now, the last point I want to make to you is that I started by telling you that I was a neurologist and interested in patient care, and I spend most of my time, actually I haven't seen a patient since I moved to New York 5 years ago. I used to attend 1 month a year for 20 years. Right now, I believe, is the time where neurobiology, basic fundamental neuroscience, the kind of things that tells us how a decision works, the kind of things that tells us how a mitochondria hooks onto the side of a neuron, okay? Those kinds of things, I think, are our best shot, or at least an important shot, at curing disease. That is, in a sense, by knowing what it is at a very fundamental level of how the brain works, how it does these very grand things like decision making, we can begin to see how those grand things, that is higher brain function, breaks down in disease. Now, it's true that many diseases are caused by genes and chemicals and toxins and things like that, and injuries and so forth. But by the time a patient comes to the psychiatrist or the neurologist, you can't repair the genes. You can't repair the damage. Well, you can try to restore functions, and I think that's the goal. And to do that, the reason I left Seattle for Zuckerman Mind-Brain Behavior Institute is because I think it can't happen just in a human brain. The human brains are going to be too diseased, and we can't poke electrodes in there. It can't just happen in a mouse brain, and it can't just happen in a monkey brain. There's all kinds of ethical reasons, and there's all kinds of reasons why some animals can do some things and some can do others. But I think coming together with a bunch of scientists, with a bunch of theorists that have interest, and open interests, not turf wars, but open interests in from whole brains and human brain imaging, like Daphne does, to stuff that I do that I showed you in the monkey, to other things I didn't tell you about in the mouse, down to individual cells and single cells at a time, and even the parts of a neuron, the subcellular components. That this all this has to happen kind of in concert with people interacting, and that's where it's going to happen. And really, to be fair, that's going to be a nidus of a lot of interaction with the medical school, with the undergraduate campus, and with our colleagues in the community, including the high school students. I hope I didn't bore to tears. And so, and with that, I will thank you for your patience and your wetness, and tell you about. Just leave this up so you can come to our next lecture.
Thank you very much. What I didn't tell you before Mike began his talk is that we collaborated. I was waiting to see if the talk would be as interesting and amusing as it was, so I'll confess now to being a collaborator. And if I wasn't already a collaborator, I want to be a collaborator now. So thank you for that. And we have time for some questions.
There's a microphone.
There's a microphone in the aisle, so it's best, if you don't mind, if you have a question, just go over to the mic so everybody can hear it.
Doctor, if you have a decision maker that has a choice between two options, is there any evidence that how that decision maker receives the arguments pro and con, the order in which he or she receives them, has an effect on the outcome?
Yes, I mean, there is evidence for that. There's evidence for things like, this is where we get irrational, right? It shouldn't matter, right? But often it is. And depending how you structure the questions, you might be more keen on the very last one, or the first one might have set you down a path so that you tend to ignore the second one. That, again, I think, is an irrational kind of strategy we use to make sense of maybe too complicated questions, and then, you know, but it gets us into trouble.
Would you say you've given neurological support for the philosophy of pragmatism?
No, but I would say one reason is that I don't really feel comfortable saying anything about the philosophy of pragmatism because I haven't read much of it. So that's not the answer you're looking for. But I don't see what I've talked about as pragmatism as much as it is sort of intentional. It's closer to sort of European lines in philosophy, existential phenomenology.
I was thinking of William James mostly.
Yeah, okay, probably yes. Many people have said that, and I've never really understood why. But that would be good. That would be good company.
So you mentioned the brain developing an expectation of some event based on, say, a bimodal distribution or what have you. Does this help explain humor? Yes.
And you see what an expert I am in that, the timing, okay? I have a friend who's very good at telling jokes, and he basically says it's illegal for me to even try. But no, of course, what do? We set up a set of expectations, and then we kind of violate them in a way that's safe. So normally we violate expectations in certain ways. It might be threatening, but we do it in such a way that somehow it becomes playful. I can't, to give it the valence of humor as opposed to threatening, that's a bit beyond what I can do, but it has that feel to me.
My takeaway from this, sorry, can you hear?
Yes.
My takeaway from this is a kind of a steady state. That is to say, you're describing a mature set of circumstances. Mm-hmm. The infant is not born with these characteristics, or is that not true? If that is true, would you make some comment about how this develops? What is the dynamic by which this happens? That is to say, comes to the model that you've presented.
Right. So I'd like to say there's two layers to that question. One is, the psychologists have over the years tracked what kinds of, at what stages of development do people develop some of these skills. And for example, like we know that people develop object constancy much earlier than they develop theory of mind. So it takes till about age 2. Daphne, correct me if I'm wrong. About age 2 before children develop theory of mind? 4. Okay, all right. I never did, is the problem. So in other words, if a child under 4 apparently will know all kinds of things. The objects are present even when they're not in the visual field and so forth. So there's a permanence to the object even when they're not within sight or within the immediate affordance of a grasp. Okay, but they will not understand that another agent, say mom, has a different sense of where the object is. So you ask those, and so those are developmental hurdles towards a kind of richer form of cognition that I was arguing is the core of the aesthetic and also of a certain form of consciousness. Okay, and so it's kind of interesting to think that would take that long to achieve since it's a relatively new phenomenon. So that's the one level at which you can explore these things. I think you made another point, which is that how do you develop the wherewithal to know that this distribution is bimodal or that those shapes have different symbolic meanings in terms of probability. And that's a learning thing. That just takes learning. But of course, what's going on in the brain during learning to support those kinds of inferences, I would argue, is not known. It's going to take the fantastic people that know about learning at Columbia, say Eric Kandel, is one of the people that recruited me here. But it's going to take understanding simple learning mechanisms and sort of scaling them way up to understand how do you make sense of something in a very, very contingent way. All right? It's not like the animal can't still use a circle or a triangle, as a way to implement, to get food or something, and not think that it always means, oh, red is more probable with probability 0.6 or something, So, and then finally, there's just the development of the brain at all. And so the whole way that the brain develops, we say in biology, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, but the brain goes through a set of developmental sequences to get to the state it's in. And in some ways, I think, this is wild speculation, that we will, in medicine, be exploiting the molecular markers of development in order to fix brains that have been broken in other ways. So all of those things come together, at least practically, I think, as that's really a prediction of where the field will go than anything I can point to.
Hi. It almost felt like neurological testament of phenomenology or existentialism. And my question was, do you find any fallacy in those philosophy in relation to the research that you're...
I appreciate that you see that connection. That's great. I don't know that they are specific enough in the at the level of neuroscience. So I mean, if I said what would be the prediction for how these neurons are going to work, there are many possible predictions, and I've made many of them and been wrong. You have to realize that one of the things that's kind of fun but also a little humbling about doing science is that you're wrong 9 times out of every 10. That's a brag. If I was really only wrong 9 out of 10, that'd be great. It's more like 999 out of 1,000. So and all of those failures are, you could say, at least for me, some way of thinking about implementing those basic core intuitions, which I get from the phenomenologists and the existentialists and whomever, but they don't necessarily lead to a biological hypothesis. A hypothesis being an idea about how something works, that is either tested or when it's tested turns out to be correct.
Hi.
Hi.
I was wondering, from everything you've studied, what you think about people who have trouble making decisions, and kind of in terms of treatment, especially not necessarily regarding neurological diseases, but even for people who are compos mentis, kind of what kind of treatment or exercises or whatever, just if you could talk a little bit about difficulty making decisions.
All right, well, this is both easy and hard. It's easy because the best way to look at someone who has trouble making decisions would be to give me a mirror. Okay, so but hard because I think it is we're all kind of stuck by that. But when things seem like they are, this is actually a collaboration with Daphne. When we seem to take forever to make a decision, one of the recent things that we've discovered is that that's because we're probably using our memory and we're almost recasting the problem afresh. Okay, and it's very interesting to think about using memory to guide you in creating new scenarios to try and resolve what seems like a difficult decision. But I can tell you what I do personally, and this is just like advice now, is that when I'm stuck, I write myself a letter about it. So when I'm trying to write and I can't figure out what goes next, I use some comments section of a paper, of Word or something, and I write myself a little note. Well, you're being an idiot. You should be able to do this. Come on, you just think about it. There must be some reason. Oh, there it is. Because you're down a different path. So that's my trick.
Well, my memory's a bit faulty by now, but I remember you several years ago, I think, saying that about theory of mind is really an agent wanting to know that there are other agents out there listening. Is that something that you did say? And if so, have you elaborated on that?
I might have said that about the SETI Institute.
I'm sorry?
I might have said that about the SETI Institute. That was a joke, sorry.
Okay.
A really bad joke. I told you, it should be illegal. But did you have a question about that?
No, it was just, I want to know if you could elaborate on it now, if you feel that same way.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't deny that that's true, because having a mind that theorizes about minds and one that does neuroscience, it's reasonable to me to think whether other people also theorize about mind, so. But that's Daniel Dennett would call that heterophenomenology. Yeah.
Thanks. Great talk. Oh.
Wait, we got 2 people at once.
Sorry,
Parallel 2 mics, but
okay.
just hang out one sec, please.
Early on, you showed us a single cell responding to a problem, and you told us that the eye is moving. Now, there is no question that there must be some connection between this one cell and all the complicated machinery that moves the eye. Are you studying that as well?
Yes. So the reason it's a great question. The reason that we target these seemingly contrived, they are contrived, but these sort of strange tasks is because I said decision making was a window on cognition. What it really is it's a tractable experimental program to understand how cognition works. Why? Because, as Newton says, rides on the shoulders of greats, because people have worked out lots of steps of visual processing in the cortex, okay? From eye right through many, many synapses, the connections between neurons. And similarly, people have worked out how the brain controls eye movements. They're the fastest movements of our body. They're extremely accurate. They're fascinating, okay? And if you took my first-year graduate course, I taught it at Washington. I haven't taught it here yet. and I hope I don't have to right now. You'd get a whole dissection working from one end to the other, and in the middle, decision making, or thought, or whatever. So, but that's just because it's tractable, because there's been so much progress on the vision side and so much progress on the motor side. I think there was he was waiting, and then.
And then there's one up front.
And then we have to get one of the students.
Me.
Yeah.
You mentioned, gave an example of how storytelling can be confusing. Are there ways that storytelling can be useful, positive in cognition and decision making?
Totally. That's why we gave the medical example. I mean, we couldn't make sense. I mean, if you make a computer program, try to do real, what they call Bayesian inference, okay, which is going to help us do things, and sort of really work out what's the best thing to do. Everyone cheats. It's impossible in real time to actually solve these, whatever they are, 30-dimensional integrals, da-da-da-da. You can't really do it, okay? So we take shortcuts, and our shortcut is we tell stories, and we're good at it. And that's what lets us be scientists and storytellers and artists, and make decisions in complicated worlds, like being a doctor. Or anything that, just everyone in this room is making really complicated decisions that would be really hard to program up. If all you had was all the information possible in the world, all the possible things you could ever do with that information, and you just had to answer problems that way, just give it up. But that is, I've just described the, what deep convolutional neural networks are supposed to do.
What I gathered tonight is that the neurons are basically behaving in a rational way. But a couple of weeks ago, Professor Schiller from Yale said that people in economics behave with animal spirits. How do you rationalize the two views of the human mind?
Right. Well, the joke, I would say, I'm so tempted to say that's true because animals are pretty rational. But, but then no, animals can't do economics. Okay, so I was trying to reconcile those points of view. Kahneman won the Nobel Prize, and Tversky would have won it too if he was still alive, for showing how irrational we are, just as Schiller would have argued. And so, but I'm claiming that we are the reason that we become irrational is because we tell stories. So with Linda, for example, the mistake we made is that I'm going to speak technically, but hopefully maybe it'll make sense, is that we confuse conditional for joint probabilities. The probability of being both a feminist and a bank teller. But we're really not doing, that's not the way we think about it in a story. We think we already got that she's a bank teller. What's the odds that she's okay. So I think those are the kinds of mistakes we make. And at least, I don't know exactly what Mr. Schiller had in mind, but I'll always be tempted to kind of explain it away that way. Not explain it away, but in some sense rationalize it. Why is it rational? Because it gives us narrative, which does get us through life. You and I were having this chat the other day, and you were eaten by a lion. So now I know, don't have a chat with the guy in this front row. It's like that kind of thing. So teach our children. Yes?
My question was that most of the sample experiments that you showed us had a lot of visual, and most of the stuff that you said about the brain, like detecting things, was mostly based on the visual senses. And I was going to ask, is the development of the brain different for someone who maybe is blind and they don't have the visual senses to rely on? Like, does it affect the temporal lobe? From my understanding, hearing is temporal lobe, right?
Wait, excuse me?
Like, my understanding is the temporal lobe is responsible for hearing. So I was saying, is somebody who's blind, who can't rely on their visual senses to detect things, is the development of the brain any different?
Yeah, well, the development of the brain is different, and it's not clear exactly in the human case how different it is, but it's very clear that blind people end up using, at least consulting their visual cortex for information that seems like it's being supplied by, say, touch, especially for Braille readers, and signs, and other kinds of things. And sound. I should have said sounds. But what's not clear is whether the way it works is different. So I'm going to talk about my favorite philosopher again. What Merleau-Ponty said is imagine the panorama of vision. That is, what the field looks like, quote unquote, to a blind person. So in a sense, you might think that the blind person has stick and the vibrations come through the hand and then creates kind of a pictorial representation of the space around, whatever the stick could reach. Okay, and now it's conceivable he would use the visual cortex for that. But I would say that what's probably very similar in both cases is that the blind person is not processing the representation of the vibration in the hand. That's just an answer to the interrogations. Might I walk into this? Might I hit this? Might I go in between? That's what Merleau-Ponty would have said. So in that sense, I think they're very similar. They're still answers to interrogations, but an interrogation about space. And now we have sort of similar views, maybe a little bit anemic, a little bit less full than we get through our vision, but still there.
This will be our last question.
Well, it comes to mind that a bat would be blind at night, but it would very definitely have a three-dimensional image of all of the space around it, an image that it would be refreshing multiple times per second. But it has to have, like I have a three-dimensional image in my visual cortex of this room. A bat would have the same kind of image in its brain, but it's all derived from sound.
Right, but okay, so that's a very similar question to the excellent question about the blind person, is that different organisms rely on different senses to different amounts, and even the same species, when one blind and one not. But I'm going to argue that what's going on, the level at which we know things, again I'll use that Greek word, gnosis, is not tied so much to the representation of information as it is tied to the interrogations we make for kind of a behavioral purpose. Now the bat knows a different world because the bat first of all flies and goes around. Bats actually can see. That's one of those things that people don't realize just because it relies on sonar. But the bat has a knowledge of space, I would say, in accordance to what the bat does with space. Okay, just as we do, and just as the blind person does.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Mike Shadlen one more time. Thank you to the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for supporting this lecture series. And thanks to all of you for coming out on a cold, rainy night and deciding to engage with these ideas. Thank you.